Now, the other technique that I want to talk about is a guy you guys can find the whole video on YouTube. It's a long video. It's called Study Smarter, Not Harder. And it's a guy that goes over a lot of techniques that you can use to improve your quality of study time. And I like to always focus on the quality of study time because, I find that a lot of people that reach out to me on Instagram, for example, they get a little bit disappointed that I don't cover content. I don't teach you guys, physiology. I don't teach you guys cardiology. And the reason for that is because we are all adult learners. I all think that all you guys are capable of self-directed learning if you have the motivation and you have the right tools to do it. And it's usually more effective than just passive watching sessions. I don't think they're the best and most effective way of learning, anyways. So, and also, I don't know everything that's on Toronto Notes. I'm not going to try to pretend I do when I don't. But the fact is that if you have the right technique on studying, you can learn whatever you want as long as it's meaningful to you and you have enough motivation and you have the tools you need. So when you think about this guy says about study smarter, not harder. And the reason why I focus on teaching study techniques is because I find, and I'm very confident on this, that if you study correctly, you're able to study less in terms of time, but with so much more high quality and using techniques that have evidence to improve memory and actually have a better outcome than people that are focused on just doing time and are not using, techniques that are effective. So people that are just highlighting Toronto notes and not doing something effective. So we talked about active studying. The other thing that you can do when you're having a hard time understanding a topic or memorizing something is putting it in chunks. Okay, so chunks means, for example, you're dividing it in smaller groups. So, for example, when you say your phone number, you usually memorize it by chunks. So you know the area code's three numbers, then you know the first three numbers, and you know the last four numbers. That's usually how you memorize things. Same with like your SIN number. They are usually chunked into like three, three, three. And why is that? It's way easier for us to remember these little chunks than to remember a whole number, thinking of them individually. When you're studying topics, it's the same thing. So if you, for example, organize your session by chunks, it already helps a lot. So, for example, you're studying a disease and you organize it by etiology and then signs, symptoms, diagnostic tests, and management. So you kind of put it into like these chunks. That already helps a lot for you to understand and to also memorize because now you're trying to memorize things that are similar in chunks instead of just writing a whole list of everything. So when you do like flashcards or study cards, you might want to put things that are similar in these chunks. And then you're able to memorize things way better. Same if you are, for example, trying to memorize medications. It will be much easier if you group medications that are similar and you do these small chunks of how you're gonna memorize. Another technique is using mnemonics. So, for example, if you want to memorize a list of diagnostic criteria, some people will memorize the first letter of each criteria and maybe form a word. Some people will form a sentence that will help them remember certain words that will trigger diagnostic criteria. So these are effective techniques that you can use that will definitely increase your memory, your ability to memorize things. Of course, we learn way more when we understand something than when we just memorize. However, we can't be naive and think that everything is possible of just understanding. There's some things that we need to memorize, like reference values or what's a normal, what is a diagnostic criteria. Like you can understand why that criteria is important, but if you're trying to memorize what are like all the criteria of a disease or the diagnostic criteria, you might need to actually memorize. So having these techniques, so like using mnemonics is really helpful. And also using drawing, and by drawing, I don't mean like artistic drawing, but any kind of diagram flow charts, connecting different subjects. So when you are able to link one thing with the other, the level of complexity in terms of learning is much higher and also stronger. So for example, you're learning about cardiology and you're reading about MI. So you're reading, let's say you're reading about MI, and you also study physiology, and then you're able to understand why MI happens, and you're able to understand, the physiology. You're able to understand why during a stress test you're able to see ischemia, and what's the difference between seeing a reversible ischemia versus a irreversible ischemia, or when you're doing a stress test, why during exercise is when you are able to see ischemia, because you increase oxygen consumption, you might decrease oxygen delivery and stuff like that. So when you start mixing, for example, physiology that you studied without context, and then you maybe studied MI without any context, but then you put these two together, the power of these two coming together makes everything make so much more sense in the context, that the ability for you to remember is extremely more likely than if you were just studying them separately. If you do a diagram or a flow chart where you connect this on paper and you write it and you visually see how these things come together, you will not forget. Okay, so that is why, for example, if you're studying psychiatry, you might want to understand how these different pathologies or different diseases might connect with each other. Or if you're studying cardiology, you might want to understand how this connects with each other. So every time you're able to do a link with something that you've studied in the past, this is extremely helpful. This will absolutely enhance your ability to remember things. Okay. A lot of the examples that come to mind are related to anesthesia because I'm an anesthesiologist, but I'll give you another example. So if you have, for example, postpartum hemorrhage, so you're trying to remember the reasons that lead to postpartum hemorrhage after delivery, and then you might want to read about coagulopathy because they come together. If you lose a lot of volume and you replace just with fluids, you have dilutional coagulopathy, and then you might, things get worse in terms of the postpartum hemorrhage. And then you go to study the drugs or the treatment for postpartum hemorrhage, and everything makes more sense. You're like, oh, so now it makes sense that, because of this, I have to use this medication because this medication will act on this part of the coagulation cascade. So if you can do diagrams, it is really, really helpful. I would always try to do summary diagrams and mnemonics, as well as putting things in chunks. So why am I saying all this? Because I find that a lot of people when they're studying, they're either highlighting or they're copying the book. Those are two techniques that are absolutely not effective. Okay, so if you're doing that, you need to reconsider how you study. Try to change that. Try to first read and then go to the paper and summarize it on your own words or using bullet points from what you read. And then you go back to the book to see if you missed something and complete your notes. Or try to put things in chunks or organize what you read in small groups that you create in your mind of what makes sense to go together. So either you divide it by topic, as I said, so etiology, and then signs, then treatment, then diagnostic criteria, or you group like medications that make sense. So antibiotics with antibiotics, beta blockers with beta blockers, or stuff like that. If you're trying to memorize lists of things, try to do mnemonics or doing sentences that would make sense. Maybe they sound funny and that's why you're going to remember them. So do that kind of thing when you're studying instead of copying the book or highlighting, because that will not help you at all. And it's very time consuming. So if you're going to use your time, you want to use your time effectively to actually use a technique that will help you remember things later.